A tiny 3% sliver of Earth stores more carbon than all world forests. This is the swamp that stores more carbon than forests. If we lose these waterlogged grounds, we unleash an environmental disaster of global scale, yet our current strategy to save them is completely backward. By the end of this video, you will see why actively farming these swamps is actually the key to saving them, turning a climate threat into a massive economic asset. Along the way, we will look at why typical flooded rice fields are actually a climate mistake, and how a single Latin word translated at a German university is changing modern agriculture. To understand this, we have to look at the sheer scale of the carbon locked beneath the mud. Forests are widely celebrated as the lungs of our planet. They cover approximately 30% of the Earth's land surface. They are vast, majestic, and highly visible. Yet they store less carbon overall than peatlands, which occupy a mere fraction of that space. It is a massive concentration of carbon hidden in plain sight, and our conventional efforts to protect it have been failing. The secret to this massive storage capacity lies in the water itself. When peatlands are rewetted and made waterlogged, the decomposition of organic matter nearly stops. This organic matter consists of about 50% carbon. In a dry forest, dead leaves and fallen trees rot quickly, releasing their carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. In a flooded swamp, the lack of oxygen slows decay to a crawl. The carbon remains trapped in the soil, piling up over thousands of years. It is a natural vault, locking away more than 450 gigatons of carbon. But this vault is incredibly fragile. You would think the best way to protect these massive carbon stores is to fence them off, declare them national parks, and banish human activity entirely. Watch what actually happens when we try to isolate these ecosystems, or worse, convert them to traditional dry farming. To make room for traditional crops, humans have historically drained these wet landscapes. The results are devastating. Drained peatlands cause significant negative environmental impacts including subsidence, nutrient leaching, greenhouse gas emissions, and loss of biodiversity. When you pull the water out, oxygen rushes in. The organic matter, dormant for millennia, begins to rot at a rapid pace. This decomposition releases massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Even though only 0.3% of global peatlands are currently drained, this drainage is responsible for an estimated 6% of all global human greenhouse gas emissions. That is an incredibly disproportionate impact. A tiny sliver of dry land is venting a massive portion of our global emissions. The ground literally sinks as the soil vanishes into the air. This degradation is occurring on a massive scale, proving that simply abandoning the land after draining it is not enough. The damage does not stop with carbon. Waterlogged bogs naturally function as nitrogen sinks, keeping the surrounding environment clean and balanced. But when we drain them for traditional farming, everything shifts. Agricultural activities on drained bogs cause mineralization and fertilization that generate nitrogen runoff into adjacent water bodies. This runoff fuels toxic algae blooms and chokes out aquatic life in nearby streams and lakes. We are left with a landscape that is actively collapsing, losing its structure, poisoning the water, and warming the atmosphere. It seems like a simple math problem. We must stop farming these areas and let them return to nature. But this brings us to a major crisis. We have a growing global population that requires more food every year, and we cannot simply abandon vast stretches of agricultural land without consequences. The global demand for resources means we need a solution that produces crops while keeping the water in place. This is where we must entirely reframe the relationship between humanity and nature. We often assume that human activity is inherently destructive to the environment, and that true conservation means complete isolation. But what if the act of farming could actually be the mechanism that saves the swamp? What if we did not have to choose between producing food and trapping carbon? Instead of keeping humans out, or draining the land to put dry crops in, we can actively manage the water to achieve both. This is not a compromise. It is an entirely new category of agriculture that works with the natural water table rather than against it. We can turn these degraded zones back into highly productive, flooded systems. This revolutionary approach is called paludiculture. The concept of paludiculture refers to wet agriculture and forestry on peatlands. The term itself is derived from the Latin word palus, which means swamp or morass. It was developed at Greifswald University in Germany as researchers looked for a way to stop the destruction of drained peatlands without destroying the livelihoods of the farmers who depend on them. Paludiculture is not about abandoning the land to wilderness. It is an active, productive system. Farmers grow crops that thrive in fully waterlogged conditions. By keeping the peat permanently wet, we stop the decomposition process in its tracks, preserving the 50% carbon structure of the soil. This allows us to keep the massive 450 gigatons of carbon locked away safely beneath our feet. You might assume we already do this with crops like rice. After all, rice paddies are flooded fields, but this is where conventional wisdom fails. Paludiculture serves as a sustainable alternative to drainage-based agriculture, unlike rice paddies which involve draining and therefore degrading wetlands. Typical rice cultivation requires cycles of flooding and draining, which actually accelerates the decomposition of the underlying peat and releases greenhouse gases. Paludiculture keeps the water table high and stable year-round. It is a continuous, permanent flood. It allows us to harvest biomass, reeds, and specialized wood without ever exposing the carbon-rich soil to the open air, representing a complete departure from traditional wetland farming. By keeping these lands wet, paludiculture systems do far more than just store carbon. They can actively manage landscape water by storing water during flood events and releasing it during dry periods of drought. In an era of increasingly unpredictable weather, these farmed swamps act as giant natural sponges. When heavy rains hit, the waterlogged farms absorb the excess runoff, protecting downstream communities from devastating floods. During dry spells, they slowly release moisture back into the surrounding landscape, keeping local ecosystems alive. It is a highly active form of climate resilience, managed by farmers who are incentivized to keep the land wet. It turns a static, vulnerable bog into a dynamic tool for regional water safety. These wet farms also act as massive water filtration plants. Growing crops on wet peatlands extracts phosphate and other nutrients, making the practice useful for post-water treatment purposes. Runoff from nearby traditional farms, loaded with excess fertilizers, can be directed into these wet paludiculture zones. The specialized plants grown here absorb the excess nutrients, cleaning the water before it moves further down the watershed. It turns a pollution crisis into a growth mechanism for harvestable crops, effectively recycling nutrients that would otherwise poison our lakes and rivers. This active biological filtering is impossible in drained lands, where nutrients leach unchecked into the water supply. However, this system is not a simple, risk-free miracle. It requires precise management, because rewetting drained peatlands can potentially cause water pollution through the release of nutrients, especially if agrochemicals like fertilizers or pesticides are applied. If farmers try to use traditional chemical inputs on a wet bog, those chemicals will spread rapidly through the water, causing widespread ecological damage. Furthermore, we must design these systems carefully to protect local wildlife. Paludiculture can sometimes act as ecological traps for wildlife, such as when harvesting activities destroy the nests of birds. If we harvest the wet crops at the wrong time of year, we can wipe out generations of nesting species that were attracted to the restored wetland. The science of paludiculture shows us that the old divide between human utility and environmental preservation is a false choice. We do not need to lock these vital ecosystems away from human touch to protect them. Instead, by turning peatlands into productive, flooded agricultural zones, rather than abandoning them or draining them for dryland crops, We can align economic food production with the planet's most potent carbon-trapping mechanism. We can actively farm the swamp to save it, using human ingenuity to stabilize the climate, clean our water, and secure our food supply. This is the future of conservation, where productivity and protection go hand in hand. If the hidden mechanics of global ecosystems surprise you, the secret system beneath our deserts is next. Subscribe to catch it.